The morning the whisper found him, Elias Hartman was standing among lilies. Fog lay low over the cemetery, a soft wool that muffled the city into distance. The markers were neat, names and dates worn to paler capitals. Elias had learned to let the ritual do its work for him. Flowers, a few words, a nod to the landscape of absence, but he had not expected conversation. He had not expected a child's voice to tilt the air. "They're not dead," the girl said, near enough that he felt her smallness against the cold stone. Her voice was too soft for the place, a thing that belonged to alleys and subway stations, not to row after row of carved granite. They lived by the river, Emma and Sophie. He turned because there was no one else to turn to. She was thinner than a winter coat should allow, a coat that had seen many winters and refused to look back. Her hair was knotted with ribbon bits, her hands knuckled raw at the knuckles. She looked at him with a steadiness that belonged to people who had learned to be watched all their lives. Elias's first response was the kind his money had taught him in other kinds of trouble. Calculate. The second was older and more complex. Across the years spent negotiating crises and delegating grief, something had hardened into the polite acceptance that he would not shake the ground under others' sorrow just because he could. 17 months and 3 weeks earlier, he had accepted a report that Clarissa Hale, had met with an accident, that the bus carrying his daughters had been hit, and that the worst had been confirmed by documents no one later contested in public. He had mourned formally, built the small monuments around his life, photographed himself at memorials, and then put his grief where it would not interfere with decisions. The whisper felt like a pebble under his shoe that had been there all along, and he had finally felt it. It lifted something he had closed with pressed and careful hands. "How do you know?" he asked. The girl, Amani, he would learn her name later, shrugged as if naming things were incidental. "I saw them. House with a red door, grey paint peeling, a spit of yard. They throw bread to the ducks like it's Sunday. One of them has a ribbon in her hair, the other, she wears a bead bracelet." She spoke in facts, as if listing the parts of a bike. "I sleep by the river. I watch people." There were reasons a person like Elias could afford to be methodical about the impossible. His life required it. But grief had its own inertia, and this small voice had the dangerous quality of opening a door he had locked. He felt the past tug. Beach photos, sun on Emma's hair, Sophie's uneven first steps, the rhythm of a life that had been ordinary and therefore difficult to imagine missing. In the same breath, he felt the dizzying possibility that the dead might have been misclassified, a bureaucratic wrong that swallowed a whole family's existence. He told himself not to jump. He told himself to call people smarter than he was about possibilities. He said quietly, "Where exactly?" Amani named a stretch of river Elias knew by name, the Hartwell River, where the estate's property tapered into public embankment. She said the house stood with its back to the water, a red door that faced the narrow lane. Elias had driven past that lane during his years of business, noted its rusting lampposts and the way the river smelled after rain, but he had never noticed a red door. Under his palm, the pebble ground itself more insistently. He did what he always did first. He asked questions and he listened. The girl's answers were deliberate. She was used to being ignored. She told him of the hours she had watched, the comings and goings, the woman who left sometimes with a paper bag and returned with her collar up, the way 2 girls ran to the water's edge and collected small treasures. She said their names, Emma and Sophie, with a tenderness that suggested she had come to know them through habit rather than intimacy. Watching her, Elias felt an internal arithmetic shift. He could dismiss the girl as a liar, a fantasy, a child with an active imagination. Or he could do something neither impulse nor etiquette would approve of, listen until the listening mattered. He thought of the lilies again, their white faces turned toward the dull sky, the way he had memorized his children's handwriting on a folded paper he kept in his desk. He thought of all the things that might be wrong because someone needed to be seen, "Come to the house," he said finally, more to offer shelter than to promise belief. "We can talk." She accepted, as if she had always expected relief to come in corridors built for others. When she walked away, she did not run. Her footsteps were sure and small. The way she moved made the estate grounds look too large and too ambivalent. Two states Elias had come to inhabit. Inside the Hartman house, June, called June by everyone who loved her, moved with the practiced gravity of domestic authority. June had been with Elias's family longer than any other living domestic history. She had seen a company founder's marriage through, had swaddled new babies in towels that smelled faintly of starch and soap, and had never once condescended to anyone who needed warmth. When she met Amani, she did not ask where she belonged. She offered a towel and a cup of tea, an act that registered like an apostrophe in a sentence that Elias could not yet finish aloud. Amani curled her hands around the tea, heat worrying at the paper-thin skin. June folded a towel and set it over the girl's knees without asking. She called the girl child in a way that did not presume ignorance. "You stay," June said. "You tell me what you know while the gentleman calls his men." Elias had picked up the phone before he had realized the words left his mouth. Thomas Knight's voice was easier to find than the feeling in his chest. Knight had been a disciplined presence in Elias's life since the early days of the business, an investigator who never showed his temper publicly and could translate rumor into fact without noise. "I need a recon," Elias said. "Discreet. Red door on the Hartwell Lane. I have a witness." There are calls a man with money makes quietly because the stakes involve more than property. Knight understood the implication of the whisper without dramatics. "If what she says is true, are you prepared for the fallout?" he asked. Elias could feel the estate watching him. Walls full of frames, a housekeeper's careful eyes, the carved initials of a life that had once been measured in planned philanthropy and corporate rationales. He imagined the headlines, the way a story could unspool into reputational risk, litigation, prosecutors leaning into public anger. He also imagined finding two living faces where he had only photographs and a carved date. "I am prepared to be prepared," he answered, which was a kind of answer for a man who had learned to buy time and information. He instructed Marcus Bell, the family's attorney, to begin drafting emergency motions, phrases he did not yet allow himself to hear, like custody order and forensic document review, and to make calls that could turn curiosity into legal position. Elias told Knight to assemble a small team, someone to run cameras, someone who could interpret the movement of people as easily as a sailor read tides. He told them to be lawful, to coordinate with the police if needed, to avoid anything that could be called vigilantism. He wanted professionalism like an anchor. He wanted the law to be the light, even if he walked toward the dark. For Amani, the house was a new geography. She had seen mansions from across fences, their silent lawns, the glint of distant windows. She had never been invited inside. She accepted the cushion on the sofa with a caution that made no pretense of propriety. June brought out a tray of pancakes, thick and aromatic with butter. Elias watched them from the doorway, watching his hand steady at the rim of a china cup, feeling the oddness of sharing a domestic scene that had once belonged only to him and invisible ghosts. "You're not like the others," Amani said between bites, as if offering an observation was a currency. She spoke of a shelter with an old radiator that coughed at night, and of a woman who beat time on her thigh when she was nervous. Of the names the girls in the park called each other, she had a catalogue of small, useful facts. "I watch. People tell me their rhythms." Elias listened. He tried to think of ways to thank her that did not feel like charity. He thought for a moment of how grief clipped him off from simple gestures. He had ceased to notice little things, how pancakes browned at the edges in the way Jan had once done for a child, or the particular timbre of a child's laugh. The girl's presence, pragmatic and unromantic, pushed at those partitions. He found himself telling her small truths about the girls he had lost. Emma had been solemn too soon, drawing with an intensity that chiseled the world into lines. Sophie had been soft with things, leaves, puppies, held the world's edges as if they were fragile. He told Amani about Sophie's bead bracelet, the one he kept wrapped in tissue in his desk drawer because he could not bear to fold it into the drawer marked Archive. He did not say why he kept it, only that some things kept the shape of people. That evening, with cameras unloaded into cases and a surveillance van idling in a lane Elias had thought belonged to strangers, Knight briefed the plan in a room with maps stuck to the walls and a laptop that hummed like a thinking animal. The team moved with quiet competence. There was a rhythm to readiness, a checklist of permissions, a handoff to someone who could coordinate with Detective Hayworth at the precinct if needed, a call to a child specialist should any children be recovered and require care. Elias sat at the edge of the meeting, as if his presence could be optional in the decision-making process. He needed to be informed, and he needed to be measured. Both were hard when the past had been handed back to him in the voice of a child. Knight walked him through surveillance architecture in words that reduced fear to process. "We watch patterns," he said, "not hopes. We look for movement, for routines. If we see the children, we document. If we act, we do so with warrant and patrol support where possible. We don't take them into our hands and run." Elias agreed because he had to. He agreed because the law provided cover for human impulse, because he needed to believe in systems larger than him. The alternative, the private retrieval of what might be his family, terrified him in a way that passwords and off-site banks never had. He had been schooled in plausible deniability. He preferred, in this case, to be moral and visible and accountable. They set the van near the embankment with field cameras angled to pick up the Red Door's approach. Knight's team threaded cables to trees, planted a camera under the lip of a public garbage can, and nicked a ring of GPS markers across the lane to catch any car that moved in and out after dark. The river made an undercurrent to everything, a low hush that stole sound and smeared it, and the team worked as if painting on a wall of water. Amani volunteered to show them the route, the shortcut to the river, the back alley where a boy sold bootleg sweets, the store that closed at 9 and where the woman with the red scarf sometimes bought bread. She had a map in her head, the way certain people carry the subway system in theirs. She walked the adults through paths that were not on their maps, and they listened because she was right. Elias went with her once, trailing in polished shoes that sank a little in the mud and felt clumsy in the landscape of the small, knowing things that kept other people alive. At night, Elias lay awake in a room that had once held a child's presence by default. The bed felt too big, the silence small and heavy with possibility. He thought of procedural things to do next, meetings with forensic specialists, copies of birth certificates, the need to place an emergency motion that would allow the court to issue protections for children found alive under suspicious circumstances. He also thought, embarrassingly and incessantly, of the way Amani had watched him eat, the way she had broken a pancake in half and given him the smaller half, as if it were a test. He pictured Emma and Sophie sometimes as they had been in photos he kept, sometimes as he imagined them might be now, older than a photograph's frozen smile, lean with river air, mistrustful of men who wore expensive watches. He had to guard that image against making them curiosities in a story. They were human and complicated and, if found, frightened. A week of observation stretched into several small electric days. There were nights when nothing happened and days when the river seemed to hold its breath. The surveillance feed, a grid of tiny windows like a mosaic, yielded images of mail carriers, a lurching bicyclist, Clarissa once leaving with a parcel and returning with the same bundle 4 hours later. There were moments of ordinary life that suggested the presence of children, a line of small shoes by a doorway seen through a narrow gap in a camera angle, the shadow of something like a ribbon flaring at a window, toys glimpsed in a yard that seemed more ragged than privileged. One such evening, over coffee gone cold, Knight brought up the most notorious piece of the puzzle. "If they're alive," he said bluntly, "we have work to build a legal case to unseat whoever is holding them. That requires evidence of misrepresentation. It requires documents, testimony, proof that these girls were declared dead, either under false pretenses or through malfeasance." He spoke in the plain, blunt way of someone who knew that the law needed scaffolding, not sentiment. Elias felt the weight of what that sentence implied. To reclaim his daughters would mean passing lies and contracts and evidence. It would not be the simple cinematic rescue he imagined in his lonelier hours. It would be a messy, public calculus that might rip the family wider open. But for the first time since the coroner's report, he felt the momentum of intention, not only to know, but to act. In the interim, the household took on a different texture. Jun installed Amani in a small room by the service wing with a new blanket and a lamp that made her face softer at night. She taught the girl how to make pancakes properly, the way to watch the pan until the edges browned the right way. Amani learned quick methods to fold beds and the names of the spices in the cabinet. Elias found himself listening to the house as if it might answer him. On one quiet afternoon, he walked into the kitchen and found Amani reading with June, lips moving with the cadence of words she had no obligation to learn. The sight was achingly domestic. It was also a rehearsal of things that might be possible. They did not speak about Emma and Sophie in the house, at least not directly. It was a rule that the adults kept. What passed for tenderness did not demand the shards of the past be always pried open. Sometimes Elias would sit by the piano and play a piece he had not touched in years, a careful, uneven thing that made both Jun and Amani look up. The music was not for them in particular. It was a salve for a man reacquainting himself with a family he had kept in boxes. The first piece of undeniable evidence arrived the way most realities do, in small, incriminating increments. A camera, planted beneath an overhanging eave, had caught, at precisely 6:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, a girl with a ribbon in her hair, standing at the end of a garden path, looking out toward the river. She turned, and the camera collar caught the curve of a bracelet around her wrist, beads of mixed color. The image was grainy, but recognizably a child's profile. For all the fog and distance, Elias recognized the angle of the neck, the way the girl tilted her head when she laughed in old photographs. The image was delivered to the team in an encrypted file, appearing on screens with a soft chirp. The room went quiet, as if someone had turned down the volume on the rest of the world. "Who pulled this feed?" Marcus asked, his voice a brittle rush now that professional caution met private hope. He had his legal pads open, a pen poised as if the physical act of writing could make this less ephemeral. Knight did not answer the question directly. He pointed at the screen, where a still frame enlarged the child's face. "We need to corroborate," he said. "We need to link the image to a date, and to the presence of the person we know as Clarissa Hale. We need more than an image. We need proof of custody, misrepresentation." No one in that room wanted to minimize the weight of what they saw. Elias, who had built empires on assumptions about risk and reward, felt the old certainties wobble in a way that left the floor less solid. He had thought that acceptance was the end of grief. He had not appreciated how acceptance could be undone by a single breath of possibility. He also felt, with an odd mixture of relief and dread, the fierce clarity of responsibility. If the girls were alive, he could not simply reclaim them and shut the world out. The law would demand transparency. The public would demand answers. Clarissa, if implicated, would be human and angry and complicated. There would be a story to fight. The press alone would smear the edges off nuance and spin the simplest fact into a spectacle. Elias thought of Danielle Mercer, the media strategist he kept for moments like this, someone who knew the way narrative shapes a courtroom or a settlement. He picked up his phone and dialed, already moving down lists in his head. legal prepping, contingency for leaks, binding statements that would hold up under fire. For now, though, they had the image. That was enough to make the next step inevitable. It was enough to mobilize a cluster of professionals who understood chain of custody, who could authenticate a snapshot, who could cross-reference a bracelet with what items he could document as Emma's. It was enough to make human beings do what the law will grant them permission to do. Act. After the meeting, Elias walked to the river alone. The water held the sky like a secret, and the red door, seen from a distance, looked like a small wound in the line of houses. He stood with his hands in his pockets, the wind tugging at the lapels of his coat. The whisper that had once threatened to be a child's fancy had proved resilient. He closed his eyes and let the river's taste come to him, a little metallic, a little earthy. He felt, absurdly, the sensation of being young and frightened and on the verge of a decision that could not be unmade. When he returned to the house, he found Amani waiting by the piano, her hands folded, as if she had been braced for the world to change. She looked at him and said nothing. He sat beside her and placed his hand over hers for a moment. It was a small, unarranged gesture that meant more than any affidavit or surveillance still. There was a silence between them that was not empty. It was compact with what might be possible and what might be lost. "We'll do this carefully," he said, more to himself than to her. "We will do it right." Amani nodded. "I don't want anyone to get hurt," she said. "They don't know me. They think I'm nothing." Later that night, when the surveillance team uploaded the day's footage and stretched it across monitors, someone noticed an envelope tucked into a crevice of the veranda's step. An envelope with no return address and a single photograph inside. The photograph was small and damp around the edges. It showed two girls in a park, with a ribbon flaring at one girl's hair. Written on the back, in a hand that trembled yet was deliberate, were the words, "Remember, for your sake." Elias held the photograph between his fingers, as if it were the last fragile thing in the world. He thought of the way truth can carry knives as well as relief. He thought of Clarissa's possible motives, grief contorting into possession, fear cascading into claim. He thought of courtroom glare and reporters sharpening questions. He thought of what would happen if the tabloids found out before the law had secured the facts. He made phone calls with steady hands. He instructed Knight to prepare not a rescue, but a retrieval in coordination with local law enforcement if the proof continued to mount. He asked Marcus to prepare motions that would allow sworn affidavits granting access to any children located on private property. He asked Jun to make Amani comfortable and to see to her needs without casting the girl as a witness in front of other journalists. He asked Danielle to hold a line with the press, no statements without counsel. Each instruction was a small piece of armor. Amani slept that night in the room by the service wing, curled around a pillow as if it could hold her in place. She awoke before dawn and made her way to the river's edge. Elias saw her go from the study window and felt a pang of something he had not intended to feel. Protectiveness that did not come with press releases or legal briefs. He went to the door because he could not help himself, because the river seemed like a place where, if truth was a body of water, you might smell its course and find what had been hidden. He found her sitting on a bench, with her knees drawn up, watching the water move as if it might speak. He did not join her immediately. He let a man who had spent a life building walls sit in silence and learn the map of another's watchfulness. "Why them?" he asked finally, perhaps the only honest question to ask. Amani shrugged. "They looked like they were waiting," she said. "Like when you wait for the light to change and it doesn't. I thought someone might come for them. Nobody did." Her answer was simple, and its simplicity made it harder to ignore. It was the kind of truth that does not need drama to be convincing. It was the kind of truth that can turn a life around a single hinge. A whisper at a riverbank, a man who had been told to accept, a girl who watched and refused to forget. They went back to the house when the sky was lightening. Outside, the red door looked less like a wound and more like an invitation. The surveillance van idled, its cameras up, the team ready. Elias felt the old mechanisms of decision click into place, the ones that would carry him into litigation and light, away from the quiet of acceptance. They had no certainty except for a few cautious images and the insistence of a child's memory. That would have to be enough to begin. Night settled over the embankment like a curtain pulled tight. The surveillance van screens glowed in the dark, a constellation of little squares capturing a neighborhood that had learned how to hide within its own ordinariness. Elias watched from the back of the van for an hour, hands folded the way someone folds himself against a storm. The red door sat in one window like a small, stubborn punctuation. The river beyond shuffled the shore in quiet repetition. Thomas Knight moved with the economy of someone who had rehearsed calm. He toggled feeds without drama, murmuring timestamps and noting motion in a brisk cadence. Jun's name came up in quiet logistics, meals, a plan for Amani if the operation widened, and Elias felt grateful all over again for the domestic constancy the house provided. It steadied him in a way numbers and lawyers never could. The feed caught movement at dusk. A woman emerged from the house carrying 2 paper bags, walked to a bus stop across the lane, and returned after nearly 2 hours. Later, a round shadow of small feet, too quick to be mistaken, flitted past a window. The camera that had been planted low to the veranda had captured a toy, left on the step for a few minutes, then retrieved. The team catalogued. Knight marked each observation with a dot on the map, building a pattern. "Keep this rolling," Elias told him. "Any sustained pattern we document, chain of custody on everything." "We're not watching hope," Knight said, almost apologetically. "We're watching for a record." They worked through the night, because evidence is patient and the law is not. Documents were drafted in the early hours, an ex parte emergency motion requesting court authorization to enter the property, to take physical custody pending investigation, should clear evidence suggest the girls were alive and held under misrepresentation. Marcus Bell prepared affidavits, drawing language from the day's images, from Amani's witness statement, simple, direct, a child's clarity turned to legal purpose, and from the surveillance screenshots authenticated by timestamps and GPS collars. They requested the involvement of Detective Hayworth, whose presence would transform a private retrieval into a lawful operation. Detective Hayworth took the case with the careful cleanse of a professional who'd seen too many headlines become tragedies. He read the files in a small, bright office, scented faintly of coffee and the municipal. "We do this by the book," he said, which was the only promise law could safely make. He had a warrant prepared contingent on the motion's approval, and he coordinated a team from the local precinct to meet Knight's unit at the edge of Hartwell Lane. There was a third actor, Child Protective Services, on call, ready to provide immediate care and medical evaluation should the girls be found. Elias sat in the back of the conference room as others assembled the pieces. He tried to keep his pulse level. The mechanics of court filings and warrants were familiar instruments in his life, but he had given his heart away once and wired it against easy access. Sitting there waiting for the judge's clerk to file the emergency order, he found his palms were slightly damp. At noon, the order came through. The judge had considered the photo, the corroborating surveillance pattern, Amani's sworn statement, and the chain of authority that tied a father's standing to a child's welfare. The language of the order was precise and austere. Authorized law enforcement to enter the premises, take immediate custody of any minors found, and preserve all evidence of custody misrepresentation pending further legal review. It was not a rescue story written for cameras. It was a warrant signed in sober ink. "Detective Hayworth will coordinate the handoff," Knight said, shaking Elias's hand with an unremarkable firmness. We stand aside where law requires, and we make sure evidence is protected. No heroics. When officers went to the door that evening, they did it in unshowy numbers. 4 in uniform, 2 plain clothes, a social worker with a soft voice, and a photographer to begin the evidentiary record. They knocked. There was a rustle, and then a woman's voice, measured and careful. Clarissa opened her mouth and answered before the deed became inevitable. She invited them in with the kind of hospitality people use as armor. Inside, the house smelled of river-worn wood and boiling tea. 2 small figures hunched over a packet of biscuits at a table, ribbons tangled in hair and knees scuffed. Police moved, polite and efficient. A juvenile specialist asked a series of practiced, gentle questions, while the girls at first merely stared as if at a weather change. The younger one stayed close to the older. Both were wary as birds whose nest had been moved. An officer read the emergency order aloud, a formal litany that felt to Elias like a turning of a page. There was reluctance, physical, visible, but no violence. Clarissa answered with the soft, defensive rhetoric of someone who has convinced herself of a narrative so many times that it becomes her truth. She claimed protection, a necessity born of fear. Her words were earnest and cluttered with a grief so raw it sounded like accusation. She had saved them from a world that would harm them. The world, she implied, would have done them worse. The arrangement of facts would have to be unraveled in court, but the immediate imperative was the children's safety. That, the officers understood, superseded narrative. The social worker took custody, wrapped the girls in blankets, and led them gently down the small hallway as their eyes darted toward Elias. They had never met him, and yet something like recognition passed through that moment, like a half-remembered tune. Amani watched from the doorway of the service wing, shoulders tense and small. She had not wanted the girls to be hurt. She had only wanted them to be seen. Elias stepped into the hall and found his knees not quite steady. He greeted the girls with all the careful vocabulary of a man who had been schooled in the articulation of sympathy. Soft voice, small smile, nothing that asked for payment in kind. Emma, the older, inclined her head with a guarded intelligence. Sophie hovered behind, fingers curled around a bead on a bracelet that sparkled in the strip of light. Neither spoke more than a breath. "Hi," Elias said, as much to make the space less strange as to speak an invitation into their new reality. "I'm Elias. My name is Elias Hartman." Their eyes, so like the photographs, met him with the compress of surprise and something thinner. Politeness, practiced in the absence of safety. Elias felt with a strange and immediate tenderness his previous life pressing into the corners of the room. He had rehearsed this meeting in his head as both politician and parent, and for both roles his voice cracked the same way. The first hours after recovery were a tangle of professional care. The girls had medical exams in a small, calm room where nurses asked for allergies and whether they were hungry. They were exhausted, which is often the first honest reaction of children who have had to make themselves smaller to endure large things. They were offered snacks, water, a stuffed animal in a blue wrapper that someone had kept. When the social worker asked if they had immediate needs, Sophie clung to a bead bracelet like a talisman and said nothing. Child Protective Services arranged a temporary shelter for the night, a place both secure and discreet, while the legal machinery prepared for the custody hearing. Marcus Bell filed an emergency petition that would allow Elias temporary custody while the state investigated the circumstances of the girl's prior declarations of death. The petition cited the photographic evidence, the surveillance corroboration, and the sworn testimony of the witness, Amani, and argued that immediate protective custody was in the children's best interest. The judge, mindful of precedent and moved by the combination of evidence and the team's professional recommendations, granted a provisional order. The move from that small municipal shelter to the Hartman estate was deliberately slow. Professionals understood that sudden reunions can feel like storms. The girls were brought in under supervision. A pediatrician accompanied them to the house to assess both physical and emotional state. They arrived quietly, hair damp from rain, eyes enormous with a kind of tentative awe, and measured distrust. The house, that had been a mausoleum of memory for Elias, became this, a place to set down the heavy things of the night and begin to measure the small ones. Jun met them in the kitchen with warm hands and asked their names as if she were learning a recipe. "Pancakes," she offered, and Sophie nodded, the smallest movement of trust. Jun led them to a table where Amani sat quietly, hands folded like someone asking permission. Amani had been the witness. Now she was also, in a small triangular way, the bridge. Emma drew back slightly when Elias approached. He did not force. He brought 2 plates, one with exactly the way Jan had once served them, and set the table the older way, not to recreate the past, but to provide a map. Emma looked at Elias, then at the pancakes, and then back at him, eyes scanning for the kind of man, the sort of father her life might now require. She asked one question, brief and precise. "Do you have books?" Elias, who had kept a library as if it were an archive of temperaments, felt an almost comic relief. He fetched a low pile of children's books with soft covers, pirate maps, animal tales, a book with blank pages that an adult might use to capture a child's drawings. Emma's hand lingered over pages like a person remembering the touch of a place. That night, when the girls were installed in a room softened by June's knowledge, Elias sat in his study and wrote. He wrote the names of checkpoints and motions, the list of people who would testify to nothing more than an answer to the question, how did the records say they were dead? He had no certainty about Clarissa's motives, fear, grief, a twisted logic that might have rewarded secrecy. But he had the sequence that would build a case, evidence of misrepresentation, forensic analysis of documents, financial ledgers, and any private communications that might shed light on collusion. He also had a gateless anxiety about the media. A leak could spin the story into something spectral and monstrous, reducing the girls to pages of speculation. He called Danielle Mercer. Danielle had a voice that mapped the terrain of public feeling with clinical skill. "We prepare a statement," he told her. "No speculation. Protect the girls' privacy. Emphasize that authorities are involved." "We'll hold to facts," Danielle said. "We steer away from narrative flourishes. You want sympathy, not spectacle." "Exactly," Elias said. "Focus on safety. Talk about cooperation with law enforcement and the children's well-being. No details about the recovery, no photos, not yet." Danielle's strategy was surgical because she had learned that public appetite can devour nuance. She believed the story could be contained to the facts the courthouse allowed. That would change. Someone, or some outlet, would try for more. Over the next week, the investigation widened like a fan. Forensics examined the death certificates that had been filed 18 months before. Forensic document analysis, described in non-technical terms by an analyst who testified to ink variation, signature comparison, and anomalous filing timestamps, found irregularities. Banking ledgers were subpoenaed and showed payments routed in patterns that suggested concealment rather than care. A ledger belonging to a man named Raymond Leach surfaced, a concise list of fees and dates with Clarissa's name scribbled alongside amounts that matched certain timeframes. Conversations harvested from old cell records did not themselves prove malfeasance, but they painted a pattern, payments, meeting dates, and an odd choreography of movement around the time of the original incident. Clarissa's half-sister, Margot Vell, emerged not as a caricature, but as a person bound by her own version of loyalty. Margot had a history of debt and haste. She had contacts, meaning people in grey areas who could make documents appear less fragile than they were. It would be Margot and Raymond who threaded the tentative conspiracy, according to investigators. Margot's fingerprints were around the edges of the plans, Raymond's accounts choked with transfers. Clarissa, according to the evidence, had been the architect of her family's fortress of silence. The motive, whether fear of oversight, a desperate belief that she had to protect, or the darker hum of control, would be argued and unpacked in court. The leak came on a Wednesday. A regional blog, hungry, unvetted and swift, posted an item that pried at the seams: Hartman heirloom or hoax. The headline spread like a small fire. Within hours, the story had been picked up by larger outlets that demanded the exhilaration of certainty. Comments poured in, many ignorant, some cruel, and the narrative, no longer in the sober hands of Danielle, began to twist. Clarissa's camp, sensing a chance to reframe the conversation, put out a statement through her counsel suggesting that any removal of children was an unjustified abduction, arguing that the mother had acted to protect them. The public, hungry for an antagonist, chewed. Elias realized, with the clarity of someone who had once navigated hostile takeovers, that truth could be bullied. Danielle arranged a press briefing carefully worded to counter speculation without revealing unnecessary detail. Authorities involved, respecting privacy, trusting legal processes. The message was deliberately bracketed by appeals for compassion and reiteration that the girls' welfare was the primary concern. The line between privacy and public curiosity frayed, though, and Elias found himself angry at the simplest cruelty of the leak. Who had betrayed the chain of custody? Who had profit in a raw story? Threats followed, anonymous at first, then material. An envelope with no return address appeared at the estate gate. Inside was a photograph of the girls at the river, with words stamped in red across the bottom. Remember. Another set of envelopes contained curated, intrusive pictures of John arriving at domestic errands, images meant to unsettle. Marcus logged the threats with the police and requested a restraining order and extra patrols. Detective Hayworth doubled security details around the house and suggested protocols: no personal travel alone, varied routines, and an encrypted line for John and the household to use for communication. Marcus also advised establishing a buffer with social services regarding the children's school placement to ensure they would not be exposed to the press. The threats were part of an escalation strategy. Someone was trying to push, to force the Hartmans to misstep. Elias felt the pressure physically. Old instincts, shut down, fight or hide, rippled through him. Knight suggested a measured plan. They would leak nothing, they would preserve evidence, and they would bait the others into showing hands. It was the only way to force proof out into the light without allowing the story to be weaponized. Margot Vell made her first overt contact 2 weeks after the recovery. She arrived at the river in a small rental car, a woman who wore urgency like a second skin. She left envelopes at a bench near the red door and watched, waiting for movement. Raymond Leach lingered at a discreet distance, doing what fixers do: measure, consult, make contingency plans. Elias and Knight, in coordination with Detective Hayworth, staged a controlled surveillance operation centered on the bench. They were not hunting for a confession. They were hoping for evidence of intent, a handoff, a payment, a conversation that corroborated the ledger. It was at dusk that the trap closed. Margot took the bench, and as she sorted through an envelope, Raymond approached. He handed her a small bundle. The exchange was filmed in grainy night vision. The officers, patient and procedural, stepped out then. They read rights. Margot protested, not with rage, but with a bleached calm that suggested she had rehearsed grievance. She said she was protecting her sister, that she had only wanted to speak, to negotiate, to secure a safer place for everyone. What came to light, however, was far less noble. Recorded conversations, the kind caught by the team after obtaining court permission to place a covert audio device, revealed Margot arranging payments and discussing how best to manage perceptions after the original incident. Raymond's fingerprints and a trail of transfers further showed the architecture that had maintained the false death. Margot was arrested on charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Raymond was tracked down in a hotel room and taken into custody when his passport attempts suggested he might flee. The arrests shocked Clarissa and splintered her statements. Suddenly the defense narrative, some mixture of protective motherhood, looked shackled to tangible illegal actions. The public, watching the arrests through cameras and live feeds, found the story less clean than they had imagined. Some expressed outrage. Others asked why systems had failed for so long. The press cycles circled and then concentrated, and Danielle kept the family's voice focused on the human stakes, the girl's therapy, the due process, and the desire for the court to reveal its facts. The legal proceedings shifted from rescue to inquiry. The state filed charges: falsification of records, conspiracy, child endangerment. A district attorney prepared an indictment that would rest on the chain of evidence they'd assembled. Clarissa insisted on her own counsel and did not surrender to a simplistic villainy. She testified, in part, in an early hearing, her voice low and tangled. She insisted she had feared for the girls, that the system had failed her, and that she had done what a desperate mother might do. Her testimony exposed the rawness of someone who had been both bereaved and perhaps deluded, someone who had built a wall to keep pain at bay. She never acknowledged the ledger's transfers or the forged timestamps outright. She insisted that Margot and others acted without full disclosure. The prosecutors, patient and methodical, laid out the paper trail. They called forensic document analysts who, again in non-technical but clear terms, described anomalies in signatures and filing dates inconsistent with standard processes. They called bank investigators who traced transfers. They called witnesses who testified to being paid to handle documents and to be present during key moments. The girl's presence at crucial hearings was handled with extreme care. The court allowed limited, carefully mediated statements from a licensed child specialist who had assessed the children and could testify about their initial state and their needs without exposing them. Emma and Sophie were not put in the position of recounting trauma on a public stage. The law, in that way, offered a buffer. The adults in the room respected it. Elias's own testimony was plain and controlled. He described photographs that trembled, beach pictures that were not evidence but memory, and he spoke about the moral obligation that had pushed him out of the comfortable acceptance into action. He did not grandstand. He did not paint Clarissa as a monster. He said simply that he had believed the record of the children's lives had been altered, and that he had sought the law's help to restore them. His voice, when it faltered, was not a lapse of theatrics, but the simple collapse of a man remembering who his children had been and wanting them to be more than images. The trial, when it came, threaded evidence and motive with the slow exactness of legal craft. Margot and Raymond's earlier arrest gave the prosecution a clearer path through the architecture of willful misrepresentation. Clarissa's defense painted a portrait of grief, fear, and a broken system that had allowed a mother to take desperate measures. Jurors listened to dry testimony about filing dates and ink analysis, and then to human detail, notes Clarissa had written in an old mothering notebook, photographs kept in a shoebox, a series of voicemails in which her voice sequenced pleading and resolve. The jury, tasked with passing intent from pathology, deliberated over days that felt like a weighing of gutters and guardians. During one midday break, Elias walked the Hartman garden and found himself at the headstone where lilies had once been. The motif had travelled with him like a private punctuation. He had promised himself he would plant something that would not die in the way people sometimes do, roots that could anchor slowly, visibly, over years. The wisteria he'd ordered in the early weeks now came like a foreshadowing he wanted to keep. He ran his hand along the wrapped roots and thought about what it meant to wait for growth. The verdicts, when they arrived, were mixed and unambiguous in their legal conclusion. Raymond and Margot were found guilty of conspiracy and obstruction. Clarissa was convicted of falsifying documents and child endangerment, a verdict that reflected a legal view that her actions, however born of hurt, had crossed into criminality that endangered children. The judge's sentencing considered context: Clarissa's lack of previous convictions, the rawness of her grief, her half-sister's involvement, but also the need for accountability. The sentences were measured. The court framed punishment in the context of rehabilitation, mandatory counseling, and restitution where appropriate. The idea was not to exercise pain with a gavel, but to bind the law's response to both protection and repair. After the trial, an air of practical relief settled like dust over the household. The legal storms receded enough to let the domestic tasks resume. The girl's placement with Elias was formalized by court order, temporary custody, with a plan for long-term determination guided by recommendations from child welfare experts. Social services worked on ensuring continuity in schooling and therapy. A licensed child psychologist began meeting with Emma and Sophie, offering art-based therapy and slow pathways for trust. They began, in small measures, to build habits that carried meaning, a rhythm of breakfast rather than a dramatic event, a bedtime routine that was not a negotiation, but a pattern. Elias, who had spent months administering the machinery of justice, discovered that his most important work now was small. He learned, as a quick education in tenderness, how pancakes could become a bridge. He learned the exact way Sophie liked syrup distributed across the surface, thin, not drowning, and how Emma liked her orange sliced so it sat like a sun. He read aloud each night, starting with the book the girls had chosen, letting his voice take on the soft patterns of lullaby instead of legal brief. He watched Amani move through the house with a new steadiness, no longer merely a watcher, but a participant in a domestic script she had been offered rather than stolen. Amani, for her part, adapted with an iron tenderness. The house taught her small certainties, where the teaspoons lived, the proper fold for napkins, the exact angle of the pantry light when you want to read at night. She also began to show signs of the same trust that cracks open with days and small consistencies. Her laughter surfaced at odd, sudden moments, when Sophie tried to stack pancakes into a tower and toppled them, when Emma hid a poem under a teapot and then presented it like a treasure. The girls, reluctant and wary at first, began to let objects be shared and then to ask questions small as weather, as there were still days when the past intruded. A headline would resurface with some fringe commentary and the household would tighten. A letter, anonymous this time, would arrive at the gate with scrawled ink and a cease and desist. Marcus would return calls, and the camera crew would check angles. There were legal aftershocks, civil suits, media subpoenas, and the slow unspooling of a criminal case that demanded follow-up. The Hartman name, which had once meant currency in certain rooms, became the subject of some people's curiosity and others' resentment. Elias bore it with a quiet armor. He'd learned to let some things go, to spend energy where it mattered. The most stubborn work, though, was emotional. The girls' nights were sometimes punctured by shadows, sudden awakenings at 3 a.m., nightmares of buses, the echo of an absent parent's voice. The psychologist recommended guardianship routines that would signal safety: a nightlight in the hall, a set bedtime with a song, a predictable breakfast. They began family therapy in small sessions, not to rewrite history, but to teach coping and language for fear. The therapist proposed that the family create a safety map, a way the girls could point to trusted people and places. They drew, with crayons and patient hands, maps that had the river drawn as both boundary and corridor. Elias spent mornings in quieter things. He took Emma to a museum once and watched her study a painting with a critic's chin, whispering about palette and line. He brought Sophie to a small petting zoo where she learned the courage of holding a timid rabbit. He noticed Amani begin to keep a small notebook, words, pictures, lists of errands she might do. Jun encouraged this with a soft authority. She had always known that routines teach belonging as much as words. There was a public reconciliation too, of a sort, not one staged or triumphant, but one that took place in the slow reclamation of ordinary life. The press cycles cooled into longer features examining systemic failures and the fragility of families. Some commentators wrote op-eds about poverty, about how a child's whisper could change the course of powerful lives. Others argued about legal omissions. Danielle worked the public narrative with a steady hand, focusing on the children, invoking the phrasing of judicial findings, and making a modest public appeal for community support of vulnerable youth programs. She arranged an interview with Elias that was carefully framed around lessons learned rather than praise. He said only what he could bear to say, that he had believed the law might be the light, and that the girls needed stability more than spectacle. He suggested donations to local youth non-profits rather than personal glorification. It was as modest a statement as a man like him could make. Summer threaded through the house like a patient seamstress. The wisteria had arrived in a crate with brittle branches that looked unpromising. Elias supervised, digging a hole on a bright morning with Jun handing tools and Sophie handing him a smaller trowel. Emma stood back with a short poem she had written. 2 lines, spare and sincere. Roots in soil, voices find rooms, wisteria climbs, and gentles bloom. She pinned it to the housekeeper's board like a benediction. They planted the wisteria at the edge of the garden, where the lawn met the river's fence. It was symbolic, yes, but it was also an act of patience. Someone had to accept that healing is not immediate, that growth is coaxed and sometimes stubborn. Elias thought of lilies, and remembered the day at the cemetery, the whisper that had cracked his acceptance. At the sapling's base, he placed the blue bead bracelet he had kept, wrapped in tissue the way relics sometimes are, a small contact with a life that had been absent and was now being reclaimed. In quiet evenings, they began to accept invitations out. There was a small community fair, local, modest, the kind of event that smelled of popcorn and sunscreen, where the girls could step into a public world that wasn't a courtroom. They went early to avoid crowds. Emma carried a small sketchbook and drew a Ferris wheel. Sophie held Amani's hand and learned to toss a ring onto a bottle, peals of giggle making tentative bridges. Amani, who had spent so much of her childhood watching from the river's edge, laughed with a sudden full sound at something small and absurd, a dog in a costume running past. The household's security plan remained in place, scaled back but vigilant. Detective Hayworth met with them from time to time to report on ongoing investigations. Any outstanding subpoenas, Margot's sentencing scheduling, the data on Raymond's assets that might be used for restitution. The court ordered some of the adult conspirators to attend mandatory counseling and to complete supervised community service. For Clarissa, the sentence included therapy and structured accountability aimed at addressing her dangerous choices while recognizing her psychological state. Imani's presence in the house hardened into belonging slowly, like new mortar between bricks. Marcus began to draw up guardianship papers, recognizing her role in the children's lives. An adoption was not immediate or assured. Those things require court processes and time. But Marcus laid the legal scaffolding for Amani to have standing in the family. He collaborated with social services to regularize her schooling, to ensure that her history would not be a barrier. One night, months after the arrest, Amani and Elias sat by the river as autumn threaded into the air. The red door across the way had been boarded and painted a subdued grey by the municipality, an act that felt like both erasure and tribute. They watched the water gather light like a pool of small mirrors. "You ever thought," Amani started small and careful, "that things could change like that? Just flip?" Elias looked at her, at the smudge of light on the water that reflected both of their faces. He thought about the kind of change that had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with presence. "I used to believe you either lost something forever or you didn't," he said, which was the truth. He had lost a certainty and then found its absence more dangerous than the loss itself. "You taught me that sometimes being seen is the first part of coming back." Amani fiddled with the hem of her jacket. "I used to think invisible was safer," she said. "If no one sees you, no one can hurt you. But sometimes invisible means no one finds you when you need them." Elias felt the wideness of the admission. That fear had been a protection until it became a prison. He let himself be changed by it slowly. "You helped them be seen," he said. "You changed more than their lives, Amani. You changed mine." She looked up and smiled with a small, sullen pride that belonged to someone who understood the currency of acts. "We're not invisible anymore," she whispered. They did not shout it to the world. They went home and made pancakes the way Jun had taught them, thin and browned at the edges, syrup drizzled in small, precise arcs that made the girls laugh like a prayer. Emma wrote a little note and slipped it under Elias's bowl. "Thank you for not giving up." Sophie braided Amani's hair with the same careful fingers that had once tangled ribbon into her own. The domestic scene had the cautiousness of a man who had once accepted a quiet death and now refused to let complacency steal small mercies. Time continued to do what time does. It gathered days into weeks, and the weeks kept the injuries from being raw, and instead turned them into scars that would teach. The wisteria took its first hesitant hold, sending a green sprig like a greeting. Under its leaves, Jun set a small bench with a brass plaque that read nothing more than the date of the first planting. It was not a monument to triumph, it was a quiet promise to try. There were still legal details to settle. The civil suits, the guardianship papers, the final sentencing adjustments. Clarissa, in the weeks after sentencing, entered a program that combined counseling and supervised family visits where appropriate and mediated by professionals. The law had sought to protect, to punish proportionally, and to require repair. It was not perfect, and the heart of the matter, why a mother had chosen the path she did, remained complex and sorrowful. In the quiet endings of many days, the girls learned how to sleep without waking to phantom buses. The psychologist taught breathing exercises and suggested they keep a small box where they could place objects that signaled safety. Sophie placed her bead bracelet there often, and once, in a sudden, unclenched night, she left a tiny paper boat by the box with the word "river" written in a child's shaky hand. Emma began to draw again, and with each new sketch, a small confidence grew like an inner sun. Amani filled a small role, not as a savior, but as a sibling of choice and an ordinary girl given extraordinary permission to belong. The estate, once a fortress of measured grief, became, in small increments, a noisy house again. Crayons in the hall, a stray scarf left on the living-room banister, Jun's humming as she folded laundry. Light entered into corners that had been kept tidy and closed. The whisper at the river, once a fragile sound, had indeed changed a billionaire's life. It had also changed the life of a homeless child who had watched and refused to be irrelevant. It had shifted the lives of two girls who, between the timbre of a paternity and the shaping of a household, found space to be children again. It altered more than bank balances. It recalibrated responsibilities, public and private, and revealed that sometimes the smallest voice can open the largest door. On a mild spring afternoon, months after the planting, the wisteria unfurled a string of lavender blossoms like a shy choir. The family gathered with friends who had proven reliable. Jun, Detective Hayworth invited in his quiet, humane way, Danielle with a small bouquet, Knight, who preferred watching the edges, and Marcus, who'd served as the legal helmsman. They tied a ribbon at the base of the vine. Emma read aloud a short poem she'd written in a voice that wavered once and then steadied. Some roots we plant, some voices we hold. Home is a work and a keep. Dinner that night was modest and loud, full of the ordinary clatter that announces safety. Later, when the house grew quiet and the lamps threw small pools of light, Elias stood at the parlor window and watched the river move its long, patient sentences along the bank. Amani passed him on her way to bed and stopped. She looked at the river and then up at him. "You ever think the river knows things?" she asked. Elias, who for months had let the river hold an accusation and then later a promise, smiled without needing to fix anything. "Perhaps it remembers," he said. "Perhaps it's been keeping secrets until someone asks the right question." She looked at him, and in her gaze he saw the full, complicated history of a child who had never had a full house to call home. "Thanks," she said, and the single syllable contained the whole work of belonging. Gratitude, claim, and an invitation to continue. Elias felt, for once without the shock of loss, the solidity of small things. He shut the curtains and walked toward the spare bedroom that Amani had made her own. He paused at the doorway and watched her tuck a tiny toy under her pillow, the kind of ritual that repairs nights. He thought of lilies and of wisteria and of the whisper that had begun it all. The world would keep offering risks, the law would keep providing its scaffolding, the press would keep demanding stories. But now there was also a house that hummed, a garden with a vine taking hold, and two girls who were learning, slowly, insistently, how to be visible and safe. In the morning he would go to meetings and to court again, perhaps to finalize arrangements or to sign papers that turned provisional orders into plans. He would do what he had to do, but in the soft hours he had learned to be present in ways that did not resemble purchase or control. Standing at the window, he whispered into the house, not a command, but a vow. "We will keep seeing you," he said, to the girls, to Amani, to himself. "We will keep naming things. We will keep planting." The reply was small and private. The river moved on. The wisteria leaned toward sunlight. In the quiet that followed, Amani's whisper, once a pebble in the shoe of a wealthy man's grief, rested in Elias's mind as the hinge of a life reassembled. He turned away from the window and, for the first time in years, went to bed not as a man who managed things from a distance, but as one who might be present enough to notice how repair begins, with seeing, with tending, and with the courage to answer a small voice that insisted on being heard. If this story moved you, and you'd like to stand with those who work to help vulnerable children find safety, consider subscribing for more stories like this and looking into local youth support organizations. Small acts have a way of growing, just like wisteria.